You are sitting here because something in you is already tired of the story you were told about who you are supposed to become. You have been praised for your sensitivity, punished for your boundaries, admired for your insight, and quietly resented for your depth. You have been told that if you heal, you will finally become gentle without pain, loving without cost, open without fear. And yet, even as you have done the work, even as you have withdrawn your energy from the chaos that once fed on you, something unsettling has begun to emerge. You feel less explainable, less eager, less available. There is a silence growing in you that does not feel like peace in the way it was advertised. It feels heavier, sharper, more exacting. You may even fear, secretly, that healing is turning you into something colder, more distant, more dangerous than the empath you once were. That fear is not accidental. It is the threshold. What you were told about the healed empath is a moral fantasy designed to keep you harmless. It is a collective projection, not a psychological truth. The image offered to you was of someone endlessly compassionate yet finally unhurt, deeply understanding yet never confronting, wise yet always soft. This image does not come from individuation. It comes from the needs of others who depended on your permeability. In Jungian terms, it is a persona imposed from the outside, a mask shaped by the hunger of the environment rather than the demands of the self. And the danger of this image is not merely that it is false, but that it actively obstructs your development by teaching you to fear the very qualities that signal healing. The empath who has not healed is defined by diffusion. Their boundaries are porous, not because they are loving, but because their ego has not differentiated itself from the emotional field around them. They mistake absorption for connection. They confuse resonance with responsibility. This is not virtue. It is an unfinished nervous system. At the unconscious level, such an empath is governed by complexes, often rooted in early relational trauma, in which survival depended on attunement to the moods of others. The child learned that safety came from reading the room, anticipating shifts, becoming indispensable. What later gets romanticized as empathy often begins as a strategy to avoid abandonment or emotional annihilation. Healing does not refine this strategy, it dismantles it. And what emerges from that dismantling is not what the culture promised you. When the empath begins to heal, projection starts to collapse. You stop unconsciously assigning your disowned power, anger, and authority onto others. The narcissist, the tyrant, the cold one in the room, these figures once carried your shadow for you. They were inflated in your psyche because you were contracted. As you integrate your shadow, these figures shrink, not because the world has become kinder, but because you have reclaimed what you once exiled. This is deeply unsettling to the relational systems around you. People who relied on your softness to avoid their own darkness will feel exposed. They will say you have changed. They will be right, and they will mean it as an accusation. Let me speak plainly. A healed empath does not become nicer. They become clearer, and clarity is often experienced as cruelty by those who benefited from your confusion. In one dream a woman once brought to analysis, she found herself standing before a mirror that would not reflect her face. Instead, it showed the faces of everyone she had ever loved. layered one over the other, shifting and dissolving. She felt panic, then grief, then exhaustion. Behind her in the dream, a door began to glow faintly, but it was locked. When she turned away from the mirror and approached the door, she woke. This dream is not about loss of identity, it is about its recovery. The mirror is the empathic field in which she had learned to exist only as a reflection of others. The locked door is the self, inaccessible as long as her libido was bound to external images. Healing begins not when the mirror finally shows your face, but when you turn away from it. This turning away feels like betrayal at first. The empath has been conditioned to equate self-orientation with abandonment of others. But from a Jungian perspective, it is precisely this reorientation that allows the psyche to reorganize around its true center. The ego must learn to orbit the self rather than the demands of the collective. This is individuation. And it is a lonely process not because it isolates you, but because it separates what is truly yours from what never was. As this separation deepens, repression loosens, feelings you were never allowed to have begin to surface. Anger, not as an outburst, but as a steady heat. Disgust, not at others, but at the ways you once erased yourself. Desire, no longer diluted by guilt. These are not signs of regression. They are signals that psychic energy is returning from the underworld. The healed empath is often shocked by the density of their own presence. You take up more space without trying. You speak less, and when you do, it lands. This is not a skill you learned, it is an effect of integration. Here the symbol of the snake becomes relevant. In many traditions, the snake is feared because it sheds its skin. What is left behind looks like death, but psychologically, the snake represents libido that has been freed from obsolete forms. The empath sheds the skin of over-identification with others. To those watching, it appears as a loss of warmth, a withdrawal of affection. In truth, it is a return of instinct. And instinct, when it re-enters consciousness, is not sentimental. It is precise. Another dream. A man dreams he is walking through a maze at night, carrying a lantern. Every time he tries to help someone, he hears calling from the walls. The lantern dims. Eventually he is plunged into darkness. In panic, he drops to his knees. Then he notices that the maze itself is faintly illuminated, as if the walls glow from within. He stands, leaves the lantern behind, and walks out. This dream does not condemn compassion. It reveals its unconscious cost. The lantern is performative empathy, dependent on constant expenditure of energy. The glowing maze is the psyche once it no longer requires the ego to light it. Healing does not eliminate care. It removes the compulsion to rescue. This is why the healed empath often appears less involved, less reactive, even less emotionally expressive. Their feeling function has not disappeared. It has been internalized. Instead of flowing outward indiscriminately, it now mediates between ego and self. This gives rise to a new quality of relatedness. Selective, grounded, and sometimes fiercely bounded, the persona softens, but the core hardens, not into armor, but into bone. The collective resists this transformation because it disrupts familiar power dynamics. The empath who no longer overgives destabilizes systems built on their compliance. This is where guilt emerges as a final defense of the old identity. You may feel selfish for wanting solitude, cruel for declining emotional labor, arrogant for trusting your own judgment. These feelings are not ethical insights. They are residues of a complex. To heal is not to become morally superior. It is to become psychologically sovereign. As this sovereignty develops, archetypal energy shifts. The empath is no longer primarily aligned with the wounded healer archetype, endlessly bleeding for others. Instead, elements of the magician and the judge begin to constellate. You see patterns quickly. You name things without apology. You withdraw attention as a form of discernment. This can feel frightening because you were taught that love meant constant availability. But from the standpoint of depth psychology, love without boundaries is not love. It is fusion. The symbol of the locked door returns here. But now you hold the key. The door does not open to everyone. This is not elitism. It is integrity. The healed empath does not seek to be understood by all, because they are no longer hiding from themselves, and this is the reframe that unsettles most. Healing does not make you universally appealing. It makes you unmistakably yourself. And when you become unmistakably yourself, something else happens that no one warned you about. The world stops responding to you in the same way. Doors that once opened easily now hesitate. People who once leaned on you instinctively now test you, provoke you, or quietly disappear. This is not punishment. It is a recalibration. The psyche, once reorganized around the self, emits a different signal. You are no longer broadcasting availability. You are radiating presence. And presence, unlike empathy as service, confronts others with themselves. This is where the myth collapses. You were told that healing would make you endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding. But what actually happens is that your tolerance for unconsciousness diminishes, not out of contempt, but out of clarity. You begin to sense, almost physically, when an interaction is driven by projection rather than relationship. You feel when someone is speaking to an old version of you that no longer exists, and instead of explaining, justifying, or softening the rupture, you let the silence do its work. This silence is not passive. It is diagnostic. In Jungian terms, this is the withdrawal of libido from false objects. For much of your life, your psychic energy was bound to other people's narratives, wounds, and unmet needs. You were the container into which they poured what they could not hold. Healing does not make you a better container. It teaches you to close the vessel. The energy that once flowed outward compulsively now circulates inward, animating thought, instinct, and will. This inward circulation is often misinterpreted as self-absorption. In truth, it is self-organization. At this stage, the shadow becomes less dramatic but more integrated. Earlier, shadow material may have erupted in fantasies of rage, revenge, or total withdrawal. Those were compensations, attempts by the unconscious to correct years of repression. As integration progresses, the shadow no longer needs to shout. It stands behind you, solid, informing your posture. You say no without anger. You see manipulation without outrage. You disengage without collapse. This is what real power looks like psychologically, not dominance, but non-reactivity rooted in awareness. Yet this non-reactivity is deeply threatening to those who relied on your emotional responsiveness to feel real. Some will escalate. They will accuse you of being cold, distant, changed. They may even pathologize your boundaries, suggesting you are afraid of intimacy or shut down. This is projection in its purest form. They are confronting the absence of the function you once performed for them. Rather than mourn that loss, they attempt to restore it by inducing guilt. If you have healed enough, you will recognize this pattern without internalizing it. Here, the archetype of the mirror returns. But transformed, you are no longer the mirror that reflects others back to themselves. You become the mirror that shows distortion. People see themselves more clearly in your presence, and not all of them like what they see. This is why a healed empath often attracts polarized reactions, deep respect from those ready to individuate, and intense resistance from those invested in remaining unconscious. This polarity is not something you create deliberately, it is an effect of alignment. Another dream may clarify this. Imagine dreaming that you are standing at the edge of a dark sea at night. The water is calm, almost inviting. For years, you have been told your role is to swim out and save those who are drowning. In the dream, you notice figures flailing in the distance, calling your name. But when you step toward the water, you feel a sudden weight around your ankles, as if chains are pulling you down. You look down and see that the chains are attached not to the sea, but to the shore behind you. Old faces, familiar voices are holding them. You stop, you do not swim. Instead, you sit on the sand and light a small fire. Some swimmers turn back toward the shore, others vanish into the dark. You wake with a sense of grief and relief intertwined. This dream speaks to the transformation of the empath's relationship with responsibility. The sea is the collective unconscious, vast and dangerous. The old role was savior, endlessly entering chaos to retrieve others. The chains are unconscious obligations, complexes disguised as love. The fire is consciousness, warmth without immersion. Healing does not mean abandoning compassion. It means relocating it from compulsive action to conscious presence. Those who can orient themselves will come closer. Those who cannot were never meant to be carried. As this shift stabilizes, something subtle but profound occurs in your inner life. You begin to trust your instincts without translating them into emotion for others. You no longer need to explain why something feels wrong. You simply move away. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. The feeling function, once overused in service of external harmony, now works in balance with thinking and sensation. Decisions become simpler, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer negotiating with inner sabotage. The healed empath often discovers an unexpected relationship with authority. Where once you deferred, now you assess. Where once you softened your voice, now you speak plainly. This does not make you authoritarian. It makes you self-authorized. The anima or animus, long distorted by people-pleasing and fear of conflict, integrates into a grounded inner counterpart. You are no longer seeking completion through others' approval. You carry your own inner witness, This is the point at which many feel an almost existential disorientation. If I am not here to feel for everyone, who am I? If I do not absorb the room, what gives me value? These questions can provoke a temporary sense of emptiness, but this emptiness is not a void. It is space. Space for creativity, for thought, for solitude that is not loneliness. The psyche needs this space to reconfigure itself around meaning rather than usefulness. And meaning, in Jung's sense, does not arise from being needed. It arises from alignment with the self's intention. This intention is rarely dramatic. It often manifests as a quiet insistence on truth, on proportion, on right timing. You become less interested in being liked and more interested in being real. This is the moment when healing reveals its most inconvenient truth. You cannot be both individuated and universally approved. The collective myth of the healed empath promises transcendence without conflict. Jungian psychology offers something far more sobering and far more liberating: integration with consequence. To become whole is to become visible in a way that cannot be managed. Your presence now has edges, it interrupts, it clarifies. It refuses to dissolve for the comfort of others. And while this may cost you certain relationships, it returns to you something far more essential: your psychic integrity. In the next movement of this unfolding, we must look at what happens when this integrity is tested not by others, but by your own residual fears. The fear of becoming too much, too distant, too alone, because healing does not end with insight. It demands courage to inhabit what you have become. When your psychic integrity begins to solidify, the final resistance does not come from others. It comes from inside you, in the form of a quiet, insidious doubt. What if this new solidity is actually a loss of my humanity? This fear is the last echo of the old identification. You were taught to equate humanity with emotional permeability, morality with self-sacrifice, love with endurance. The psyche does not abandon these equations easily. Even as you grow stronger, a part of you may watch from the shadows, waiting for evidence that you have gone too far. This is where the work deepens, because individuation is not merely the acquisition of boundaries, it is the capacity to tolerate your own strength without disowning it. The healed empath often stands at this threshold, oscillating between relief and guilt, relief at no longer being invaded, guilt at no longer rescuing. The unconscious tries to resolve this tension by tempting you back into old roles, not through dramatic crises, but through subtle invitations. A familiar voice asking for just one more emotional concession, a situation that flatters your sensitivity while draining your vitality. These are not tests from the outside, they are negotiations within the psyche itself. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation with the shadow in its most refined form. Earlier, the shadow appeared as rage, bitterness, or fantasies of withdrawal. Now it appears as competence, decisiveness, and emotional neutrality, qualities you were once discouraged from embodying. The danger here is not that you will become cruel, but that you will disown these qualities again out of fear of being perceived as such. If you repress your strength, it will return distorted. If you integrate it, it becomes authority, psychologically understood, has nothing to do with control over others. It is the capacity to remain aligned with your inner law even when external pressure intensifies. This inner law does not shout, it does not justify itself, it simply insists. The healed empath learns to recognize this insistence as the voice of the self rather than the echo of conditioning. When you follow it, something remarkable happens. Your life begins to organize itself with less friction, not because obstacles disappear, but because you no longer create unnecessary ones by betraying your own perception. Here the symbol of the labyrinth evolves. Earlier, the maze represented confusion born of over-responsibility. Now it becomes a place of initiation. You walk it alone, not because you are abandoned, but because no one else can walk it for you. At the center is not a monster to be slain, but a stillness to be endured. Many turn back at this point, mistaking stillness for emptiness. But if you remain, if you allow the nervous system to recalibrate around this quiet center, you discover that your empathy has not vanished. It has changed its orientation. A healed empath does not feel less. They feel more selectively. Their emotions are no longer pulled outward by every stimulus. Instead, they move in response to meaning. This selectivity is often misread as indifference. In reality, it is the emergence of eros in its mature form, the capacity to relate without losing oneself. Jung distinguished this from mere sentimentality. Mature eros connects through presence, not fusion. It allows distance without abandonment and closeness without collapse. Another dream may illuminate this stage. You dream you are holding a key made of heavy iron. For a long time, you search for the door it belongs to, trying it in countless locks. None fit. Frustrated, you consider throwing it away. Then you notice a door behind you, unmarked, almost invisible. The key fits perfectly. When you open it, there is no treasure, no dramatic revelation, only a simple room with a window. Light enters. You wake with a sense of quiet rightness. This dream is not anticlimactic, it is accurate. The key is your integrated capacity, your empathy no longer split from your authority. The unmarked door is the life that emerges when you stop trying to use your gifts to open other people's destinies. Healing does not lead to grandeur, it leads to appropriateness. You are where you belong, doing what is proportionate to your energy and truth. At this stage, relationships reorganize themselves naturally. You no longer need to cut people off dramatically. Distance establishes itself through mismatched rhythms. Conversations shorten, expectations dissolve, new connections may appear, often quieter, less intense, but more reciprocal. These relationships do not demand your essence as payment, they meet you in the middle. This can feel strangely unfamiliar, even boring at first, because your nervous system was once calibrated to intensity as proof of connection. Healing retrains it to recognize stability as intimacy. Yet even here, the old myth tries to reassert itself. You may hear the internalized voice saying, if you were truly healed, you would be more open, more giving, more forgiving. This voice is not wisdom. It is the moralized superego of a culture that confuses goodness with self-erasure. Jung warned repeatedly against moral inflation, masquerading as virtue. True ethical development emerges from wholeness, not from repression. You do not become ethical by amputating parts of yourself. You become ethical by integrating them. The healed empath, therefore, becomes something paradoxical, less emotionally available, yet more trustworthy, less reactive, yet more responsive, less sentimental, yet more capable of genuine love. Your compassion is no longer indiscriminate. It has weight. When you offer it, it changes things, and because it is no longer compulsive, it does not exhaust you. This is also the point at which many empaths confront their fear of solitude. When you are no longer defined by others' emotional needs, there are moments of profound aloneness, not loneliness, but aloneness, the experience of being a distinct psychological entity. For those whose identity was forged in relational enmeshment, this can feel like a small death, but it is also a birth. In this aloneness, creativity often awakens, thoughts deepen, dreams become clearer. The psyche begins to speak in symbols rather than symptoms. You start to notice that your dreams no longer revolve around rescue or pursuit. They feature landscapes, structures, tools. The unconscious is no longer asking you to fix something, it is showing you how to live with what is. This shift marks a major milestone in individuation. Your empathy has been reabsorbed into the totality of the psyche. It is no longer your defining trait. It is one function among others. Integrated and available, what remains to be faced, however, is the final reframe, the one that cuts against every story you were told about healing. Because what a healed empath becomes is not a softer version of who they were, but a more concentrated one, and concentration, psychologically, is power. The question is not whether you can hold this power, but whether you are willing to stop apologizing for it. When you stop apologizing for your own psychic density, the final illusion dissolves. You realize that healing was never meant to make you lighter, easier, or more agreeable. It was meant to make you real, and reality, when it finally arrives, has gravity. This gravity is what others feel when they say you are different now. They cannot name it, but they sense that you no longer orbit them. You orbit something deeper, something internal, something that does not negotiate. This is the reframe that completes the transformation. A healed empath does not become an emotional sanctuary for the world. They become a point of orientation. In Jungian language, you move from being possessed by the feeling function to being centered in the self. The self does not soothe. It orders. It brings proportion where there was excess, silence where there was noise, truth where there was adaptation. This ordering force is often experienced as withdrawal by those who thrived in your openness. But psychologically, it is emergence. Look back at the symbols that have accompanied this journey. The mirror that once reflected only others now stands to the side, no longer needed for identity. The labyrinth that once trapped you has revealed its center, not as spectacle, but as stillness. The snake that shed its skin did not disappear, it became more itself, closer to the ground, more alert, more alive. These symbols do not point toward moral improvement. They point toward integration. And integration carries a consequence that few speak about honestly. You become less usable. You can no longer be easily recruited into other people's dramas, projections, or unconscious contracts. Your presence interrupts narratives built on denial. This is why a healed empath often feels strangely alone, even when surrounded by others. You are no longer participating in the collective trance. You are awake inside it. This awakening does not come with the euphoric certainty promised by spiritual cliches. It comes with sobriety. You see more clearly how much of human interaction is driven by avoidance, fear, and unexamined desire. You no longer rush to correct this. You allow it to be what it is. This allowance is not indifference. It is acceptance without collusion. You stop trying to redeem the world through your nervous system. Here, the symbol of fire returns, but not as a blaze meant to warm everyone. It is a contained flame, like the hearth in an old house. It gives light to those who sit close enough, but it does not chase anyone through the night. This is the healed empath's compassion, local, embodied, sustainable. It does not demand recognition. It does not promise salvation. It simply is. At this stage, your empathy becomes almost invisible. Even to you, it is no longer an identity. It is a capacity you can deploy or withhold. And because it is no longer bound to your self-worth, it does not distort your perception. You can see suffering without being consumed by it. You can love without merging. You can leave without demonizing either yourself or the other. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional maturity. What many find most unsettling is that this maturity carries a quiet authority. People listen when you speak, even when you say very little. Conflicts resolve or escalate quickly around you, as if your presence accelerates what was already latent. This is not mystical charisma. It is the effect of coherence. When the psyche is no longer split between persona and shadow, between compulsion and conscience, it emits a signal of internal alignment. Others feel this alignment in their bodies, even if they cannot articulate it. This is why the healed empath is often misunderstood. They are expected to be endlessly gentle, endlessly accommodating. Instead, they are precise. They do not offer false comfort. They do not soften truths to preserve illusions. And because they are no longer afraid of being alone, they do not barter authenticity for belonging. This can look like coldness to those who equate warmth with access. In reality, it is the warmth of something that no longer needs to prove itself. There is a moment, often quiet and easily overlooked, when you realize that your old fear of becoming hardened, of losing your heart, has not come true. Your heart did not close. It moved inward. It stopped leaking. It became protected not by walls, but by structure, like a house with a foundation, not a tent held up by constant vigilance. This is the final psychological truth. What a healed empath becomes is not what they told you, because what you were told was designed to keep you functioning within a certain economy of need. Healing removes you from that economy. You are no longer currency. You are no longer a resource to be extracted. You are a person, individuated, finite, and therefore real. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For the empath, this privilege is also a risk, because becoming real means becoming selective, and selectivity always looks like loss to those who benefited from your absence of it. But to the psyche, it is not loss, it is return. The call, then, is not to become better, kinder, or more evolved in the way the world defines these words. The call is to remain in alignment with what has emerged through your healing, even when it costs you familiarity, even when it disrupts expectations, even when it leaves you standing alone in your own life for a moment. Because that moment does not last, from it, a different kind of connection becomes possible, one that does not require you to disappear in order to exist, one that does not feed on your nervous system, one that meets you not as a function, but as a whole human being. That is what a healed empath becomes, not softer, not brighter, not endlessly open, but centered, and from that center, finally, free.